All right. So when we think about modern inequality areas of focus, we have race and ethnicity. So I teach a course starting this fall, Inequality in Society, and the entire course is built on these topics, okay? Race, ethnicity, gender, and gender is different than sex, and gender and sex are different than sexual identity. It's a lot more different than maybe we were brought up to believe about things, okay? Now this is, again, this is the study of these things. What I'm doing here this evening is not, rambling on about my politics and what I think and this and there's a place for that, right? But I think there's also a place for mindful, thoughtful consideration of this terminology. Because at the end of the day, if you want to affect social change, you got to know what you're dealing with, right? And I see that a lot. I see people that have a lot of energy, a lot of enthusiasm, and don't know where to go, don't know what to do. Well, this is kind of a roadmap, so to speak, okay? And we're going to get to that. And then the last area of focus that we have in modern inequality is age. Okay, now there's other things that you could add to this, but generally, race, ethnicity, gender, sex, social class, and age are the areas of most focus in modern inequality. All right? All right, so next, let's talk about terms. All right, this is where we get down to the nitty-gritty of things. Let me make sure that you can see that well enough. Let me try this. Hold on. All right. It's not working. Hold on a second. Hold on just a second here. It got kind of sideways on me. Well, let me back. Hold on, I don't want you to see too much just yet. I got some stuff I'm trying to show you here. Oh, you can't see it on the screen. Well, hold on just a second. I'm going to get this fixed. I know you can see it that way. Oops. Thanks for your patience. Just 1 minute. Got to get this right. There we go. Almost. Try one more time. All right, there we go. Okay, so let's back up. Stereotype. All right, so I think about this terminology a little bit different than some people do. Okay, I'm going to try to be very specific about what we're talking about. So stereotype, right? A simplified description applied to every person in some category. Now, I cannot understate how important this idea of categories is, right? And so what category do we fall in? And humans have a way of compartmentalizing people, right? We're going to get to that. But what category do you belong to? So I belong to a category of white, of male, of Christian, of progressive. I belong to a category of being a father. That's a category. So we're made up of a whole lot of number of categories, right? Now, a stereotype is a simplified description applied to every person that is in that category. So you probably have a stereotype. You do, okay? We all do. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm so happy that I have a few people to share that are, I think, let's see if I have I've got a couple former students in here. This might sound familiar to you, but I'm really excited to be able to share this publicly. The way that I think about stereotypes, I think it's healthy. It's mentally healthy. Okay, but we all have stereotypes. Stereotypes have a role in human life, in human interaction, in social life. They have a purpose. Stereotypes in and of themselves are not necessarily bad, and you're going to see why in just a second, okay? towards the end of this, I'm going to elaborate on that. But let's put stereotype in the context of what you just saw here, also prejudice. Now, some people think prejudice before stereotype. Okay, I see it stereotype first. So you have a stereotype, you have a simplified description about any person in a category, and then we move up the ladder of inequality, if you will, and prejudice. You start seeing the terminology changing a little bit too, right? A rigid, unfair generalization about an entire category of people. So I prefer to think about stereotype first because we're thinking about a person, okay? And then you prejudge categories of people, and of course people fall into categories, okay? And then we get into discrimination, right? And so again, I would suggest not thinking of stereotypes in and of themselves as being negative, bad, a manipulation of power. It's our way of trying to understand other people. Okay, we're going to get to that. But when you get into prejudice, and certainly when you get into discrimination, discrimination is how we treat one another. And something that I haven't mentioned yet as part of this that we're really talking about is power. Okay, so when you hear institutional racism, institutional sexism, institutional classism, inequality, what's at the root of all of that is power. Okay? And that's another reason why I'm doing this. Because these are difficult things for most people to talk about, and I'm used to talking about it. And I think I could really distill it down in a way that makes this subject matter kind of accessible. Okay? But we're talking about power now. Unequal treatment of various categories of people. So it doesn't matter if I'm black, if I'm male, if I'm female, if I'm transgendered, if I'm rich, if I'm poor. If I discriminate against people that are part of that category, regardless of who that person is, if I discriminate against that category of people, then anybody that is within that category, is going to experience the discrimination. Okay? So, on up the ladder here. Institutional prejudice, beliefs and ideas. Think about these as stereotypes and prejudice, but in the institutional domain, right? Beliefs and ideas that are built into the functioning of the operation of an organization. So institutions and organizations are being used synonymously here, okay? So how do institutions prejudge categories of people? Now, we like to think in the United States that we live in a free society. And certainly rules and regulations are incredibly important to make sure that people in an organization don't exercise prejudice and don't discriminate against people. Okay? Now, you know as well as I do that right now, again, I'm looking at my calendar, June 9th, 2020. And we'll look back on this hopefully with some reverence, this time period, right? We all know that we're looking at institutional discrimination in our country relative to the police force, law enforcement. And how have formal practices and policies been built into the functioning of the organization? Chokeholds. A level of police violence is written into the policy as acceptable in police departments across the nation. When you've got that written into an organization, that is problematic as it relates to inequality. Okay? Now, why is it problematic? It's not just problematic because if I'm a black male, I might experience violence at the hands of law enforcement more frequently than other people. It's not just that. It's not just who the category and the individuals that might be targeted by such policies. It's not just them that's affected by this. And this is why I have a tendency to think that institutional prejudice and institutional discrimination are morally, ethically, much more wrong than how I might think about somebody. Okay? And that's how I think about somebody is generally the stereotype and prejudice stuff. Okay? So looking at this another way, right? On one side over here we've got stereotype, prejudice. Let me scoot this out of the way just a little bit. We've got stereotype and prejudice, discrimination, institutional prejudice, institutional discrimination. And then on the other side, you can kind of see at what levels you're going to find these, okay? Individuals, groups, and those social institutions. Okay, well, it gets a little bit more interesting now, all right? Okay, so let's revisit this another way, all right? Make sure I'm still, okay, we're still good, all right? Let me check my questions. I don't see any questions, all right? So again, stereotype is a simplified description. Let me once again try to get that to show up better for you just to make sure. All right, it's a simplified description, okay? Stereotype. A simplified description of persons in a category. Prejudice is a rigid and unfair generalization, okay? And, think about stereotypes and prejudice as values, attitudes, beliefs. Now, we could talk about, well, where do stereotypes come from? How do people learn stereotypes? Right? How do people learn prejudice? Because it's there where we would need to go in order to change what people learn. And that goes back to the very first, one of the first slides I showed you, when you start looking at institutions. Okay? And we're going to get to that again in a few moments. Okay? Stereotypes of learned behavior, prejudice, all these things. All right? Now, stereotype and prejudice, one's perception of others. So I developed a stereotype about and prejudice about persons in a category. I developed stereotypes, prejudices about a whole entire group of people. Okay, now I have those ideas, and everybody has ideas. Everybody has stereotypes. And here's something for you to think about. Are some of the stereotypes that we have accurate? Okay? When I think about females, are some of my stereotypes about females applicable across individual females? When I think about Native Americans, when I think about the Navajo, are the stereotypes I have about the Navajo applicable across individuals that consider themselves Navajo? So again, the terminology that I'm covering here with you is applicable for race, ethnicity, for gender, for social class, for age, terminology of inequality. All this stuff is really at the heart of understanding power and understanding inequality, okay? All right, so my perception of others. Discrimination, again, unequal treatment, how I treat others, okay? Now we're getting into how I treat somebody else is going to be partly based upon my prejudices and my stereotypes. Now, some people can have stereotypes about people and treat them different than their stereotypes are. And I think it takes quite a bit of reflection and flexibility in your understanding about people in order to do that. Now, I'm not going to say that that's right or wrong. It's not what I'm here to do, okay? So discrimination. Now, let's go up the ladder here. Institutional prejudice again, and institutional discrimination. Now we're going to get to why I think that in order for us to address, for example, racial inequality in a very effective way, why we have to approach this at the institutional level is because of this. Okay? Now, let me explain this. So, when we have discrimination at the institutional level, let's just use the example of law enforcement. Okay? If we have police agencies in our country that have policies written into their practice as to how to treat Mexicans, people of color in general, of how to treat people that might be black, and there's a crystal clear example of looking at the city of Ferguson Police Department. You all remember the riots in Ferguson some years back. There was an investigation of that police department after a shooting of an African American male, and systemic and systematic racist policies in that organization. So much so, they basically disbanded the entire police department and reformed it. Sound familiar? Okay. But here's the problem. If a police department has policies, racist policies, classist policies, racial profiling, policies associated with police brutality, okay, not only does it affect people as part of a certain category, let's say that not only does it affect black males, the police department policy about black males doesn't just affect black males, it also affects me. And this is why everybody should be concerned about this. How does that policy to black males, I'm not black male obviously, how does that policy affect me? Okay? Because the police department's policy also tells me over time that, well, maybe blacks deserve it. The policy's in place. It must be okay to kneel on somebody's neck or beat somebody up. It's the policy. So it tells me that it's okay. And so, if this influences my prejudices and stereotypes about African American males in the police department, and I don't say anything, I go along with the policy. I mean, it doesn't affect me. Why would I say anything? Well, I should say something because it affects other people. That's why institutional discrimination and institutional prejudice is worse than what you think about black people or what you think about women or what you think about rich people and poor people. When we've got discriminatory policies built into institutions, now here's where it gets even more insidious. Let's say it's not just government, but it's in the educational system, it's in the workforce, it even plays itself out in the media. Then it's spread out across society, not just government, right? Not just government, it's throughout the culture. Okay? So again, let's look at an example here, or let's talk, let me talk just a few more minutes here about stereotypes. I mentioned I was going to come back to this. By the way, please feel free to ask questions if you have any, right? Let me share something with you about stereotypes. Something you've never heard before. Unless you've taken my class, you've not heard what I'm about to tell you. I can promise you that. Let me fix my video. So let me show you something about this, okay? So where do we learn our attitudes, our values, our beliefs? Where do we, develop our understanding of who we are and other people? A family, good or bad. Some people got good families, some people got bad families, but it's pretty clear that families play an incredibly important role in the lives of individuals, okay? We cannot survive as individuals without the accompaniment of other people, and usually those are family members, okay? But here's a question. Here's a question for you. I love talking about this. Two questions. How do we know strangers, particularly really young people, okay? I think she's almost 6. Yeah, she's almost 6. She's in a 6-year-old daughter. Was just finished kindergarten and has been in preschool, and she's going to be in elementary school in 1st grade next year. But it's not just for young people, it's for older people too, adults. Go back to the question. How do we know strangers? How do we know people we don't know? Now, that's a philosophical question. And here's the next question. And I wish that people could chime in. If we're in a classroom, we would talk about this. Okay? How do we know people we've never met? Is it possible to know somebody that you've never met? Is it possible to know anything about somebody that you've never had a conversation with? Can you look at somebody and make judgments about them with any level of accuracy? Yes, you can. And we do it. We do it every day. How do we know people that we don't know? There's several people that I'm looking at on this feed here. I know a little bit about you, right? But I don't know you in great depth and great, everything about who you are as a person. But think about those people that we've never had a conversation with. How do we know strangers? Through this. Stereotypes. And stereotypes are not in and of themselves bad. It helps us to understand people that we don't know. How do we live in context with other people? That really is a question of sociology and social psychology, isn't it? Right? So stereotypes in and of themselves are not bad. Don't beat yourself up over stereotypes. We all have them. How else do we relate to people we don't know? How are we able to interact with strangers out in public on a daily basis when we're not quarantined at home, obviously? But how are we able to interact? Because we have judgments and we have agreements, informal agreements between one another. We live according to laws and norms and expectations, and some of us go by those norms, and most of us do obey the law and these sorts of things. Now, again, I'll go back here just real quickly here, and I'll leave you on this for this evening. Go back to this right here. Now, stereotypes, again, in and of themselves are not bad, but when you start going up that ladder of prejudice and discrimination and institutional prejudice, that's when we start getting into the misuse of power. And this is within relationships with one another. When we're looking at this right here, this is where our relationships with other people, and not everybody discriminates. Another question about this: are there varying degrees, varying levels of prejudice? Absolutely, there are. Are there varying degrees of discrimination? Absolutely, right? Some discrimination is implicit bias. Some discrimination, treatment of others, is in the form of police brutality. So, it could go from ideas to about other people to actual treatment of other people, right? Okay, so that's all I am going to cover on